Hi, and welcome to this session on operationalizing zero trust. My name is Russell Goodwin. I'm the field CTO for Illumio. Illumio is a provider of zero trust products, and I'm here today to really talk about our experience with the successful implementations and the integration of these in customer environments. Right. So to give you some context around why I'm here, my role as field CTO. I work closely with some of our largest customers, with the most complex environments, and my job, in that function is to really help our customers define strategic approaches to successfully deliver effective segmentation in support of zero trust. So I spend a lot of time with the technology. I spend a lot of time with segmentation projects. And the primary focus there is really on how to deliver those projects to meet the right business outcomes and on the right timelines, right? So as another part of my role, I'm also responsible, if you like, for acting as an advocate for our customers into our product teams. And I'm also involved in the definition and preparation and documentation, if you like, of our best practices and standards. And we also advocate back into our customers. And this deck really just kind of represents the learnings that we've had from doing this, in practice in the real world. And I wanted to share some of those experiences with you today. Okay, so just a little section on Illumio and who we are. So Illumio is a leader in zero trust, specifically in segmentation, and that being a kind of a network security approach that lets you segment your network in an entirely topology agnostic and application-centric way to enable least privilege access to your data and applications, and ultimately to prevent the spread of breaches and reduce the blast radius of any potential compromises in the environment. Okay, so before we start, I think it's worth reflecting on what zero trust is about, because this isn't always entirely clear to everyone, right? There's a lot of different definitions, right? But fundamentally, zero trust it's an implementation of access policy with an implicit deny, and it grants explicit access based on a principle of least privilege. This is a bit wordy, to be honest, and the reason is I'm trying to be precise about this. But in essence, it means never trust, always verify. Really, what this is about is nothing is allowed unless it's explicitly stated as being allowed. And that's really the fundamentals behind what zero trust is all about. So why is zero trust a good choice? And why, is the strategy of doing this in the network equipment, kind of a flawed concept? So, as some background, the principle of least privilege, it's long been accepted as a robust baseline. Okay, this is nothing new. But the problem is that as environments are becoming exponentially more complex and interdependent, it's becoming harder and harder to achieve that approach using network choke points, right? The reason is, right, as the environment becomes more complex, the number of east-west flows and dependencies increases. It becomes really challenging from a network perspective to do enforcement based on choke points. We see customers creating ever more complex topologies. This started a long time ago with VLANs, then it progressed to virtual routing, things like MPLS to provide segmentation in the network. Then it went on to things like overlays, and then and SDNs, and in the end, it becomes the network itself, which is really intended to deliver traffic, becomes unnecessarily complex, right? And the problem is a lot of that complexity is not added for the purpose of delivering traffic, right? It's really added to facilitate security segmentation and to differentiate things and basically ensure that traffic passing from A to B passes through an enforcement point. And this is, it's kind of boiling frog syndrome where, if things just get progressively worse and worse more slowly, people tend to accept this, right? But the reality is, I think if you reflect on the way networks are being designed today to support security, it's become really quite problematic and complicated. And the problem with this, right, is you can try and narrow the gap by just deploying more firewalls in more places, right? And we have customers that do that. But I think that there's a lot of evidence for it that firstly isn't very manageable. It isn't scalable, and it certainly isn't cost effective from either a capex point of view in terms of deploying the hardware, but more importantly, it's not really cost effective from an OpEx point of view. Managing, supporting that, but also all of the change processes, firewall policy management processes, trying to keep the policy consistent and clean, it becomes a really onerous task for companies, right? And the trouble is, no matter how far you go, how many firewalls you deploy, ultimately you still are not going to get true zero trust, anywhere. And the reason is that no matter how many firewalls you deploy, you're still going to end up with security zones that contain many hosts, right, that can talk to each other without passing an enforcement point. And the basic premise of zero trust is that no connectivity is allowed unless it's expressly and explicitly allowed. And when the traffic doesn't pass an enforcement point, there's really no way to enforce that policy. Okay, so now we know, a bit more about zero trust and the challenges with doing this with traditional firewalls. I want to make it clear that it's not just about a product. Zero trust is not a product. It's not even really a design. It's more of a philosophy, right? So what you need to think about is that technology and tools and products are enablers. They help you achieve your zero trust objectives, but in themselves, they are not the answer, right? They are part of the solution, right? The implementation is incredibly important. You can take a zero trust capable product and you can implement it in a way that doesn't provide zero trust, right? So the implementation of the product is really important. And ultimately, it needs to be zero trust needs to be sort of woven into the fabric of the deployment and operational model in the organization. And what that really summarizes down to is that in order to be successful with zero trust, there needs to be a genuine organizational desire, right? And that's, I think, a key learning that we have with these projects is with all the will in the world, this can't be driven by the security team, alone, right? They need the support of the business. They need senior stakeholder buy-in, and there needs to be a general message into the organization that zero trust is an organizational objective. It's a business objective. It's there to serve the business, and it needs to be supported by the business, right? And that's really important. Okay, so what is zero trust and what is it not? This is also important, right? Because there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about zero trust, right? But if you think about what it is and what it isn't, then you can then start to think about how you're actually going to go and operationalize this in your organization. Okay, so zero trust, it is, as I said, a way of operating and thinking. It's a methodology for basically improving the maturity of your security posture. And it's definitely a way to reduce risk in your environment. And it's also a way to improve visibility, which is actually important. Even though zero trust is primarily around preventing breaches, a key part to that and to reacting to breaches and security violations is to have visibility, right? If you can't see what's happening in the environment, then you really can't react to it effectively, right? So what this provides you is the capability to reduce the risk, but also improve your visibility so you can understand your environment better, which in turn allows you to respond more comprehensively. What zero trust is not, it's not a binary condition, right? It's not that yesterday you were not zero trust and today you are zero trust. It's not that you're going to be zero trust next week, or the end of the year. It's basically a permanent, and a constant evolution, right, towards a goal. And as a result, it's never truly done, but that shouldn't put you off, right? I think the point of zero trust is, as a methodology and as a philosophy, is to always be improving, to always be reaching for better quality and to reduce the attack surface, right? And it's an iterative process, and effectively it's a journey, right? Zero trust is a journey of continuous improvement and maturity. And in fact, Forrester talk about that in their maturity model, right? About how that's, you cannot expect to become zero trust day one. You have to think about the journey and how you make improvements to the environment as you go. So to that point, zero trust is a journey. There are some things that you need to think about, right? And the first thing to think about is, what are your objectives, right? Remember that the source of truth on zero trust is really, it's the Forrester security maturity model. And that guides you on how to assess, iterate, and improve on your posture and risk controls. And for many of our customers, right, at a higher level, and for many reasons, fundamentally, the thing that they want to tackle is the problem of lateral movement, right? They want to understand and limit lateral movement, which is in effect really delivering an important component towards zero trust, right? Every lateral pathway in your environment, right, should be prevented, except for the ones that are expressly need to support and deliver the business capabilities. Okay, and that's really what segmentation is about. It's about restricting lateral movement to only the pathways that should be permitted, and that, in essence, is usually the primary goal of the segmentation project, right? So in order to start on that journey, you really have to think about how and where can I get value quickly from this? And this really comes back to the point about it being a journey, right? Rather than thinking, it's great to have a philosophy about the end goal, but fundamentally you need to understand, where do I start, right? Every journey starts with a step, and this is where you need to start. And to that point, one of the key messages through this presentation, and I can't stress this enough, is that you should not let perfection be a barrier to progress. It's very easy to get caught in what people sometimes call analysis paralysis, right? Where you're spending so much time identifying how to achieve perfection that you really don't make any progress in the project, right? And that is something that you need to take a really pragmatic approach on. You need to think carefully about, and you need to make sure that whatever you're doing, even if it's iterative, that you're making progress, right? Every time you make progress, you mitigate risk, you reduce the opportunity for breaches to persist around the environment, and you reduce business risk as well, which is ultimately what this is about. So what we normally recommend is actually early in the project, it makes sense to start with simpler controls. And I kind of highlighted this on the slide, right? You've got critical apps, you've got non-critical apps, you've got test and dev environments. That's a very good place to start, right? Think about, how can I, protect my critical apps from my non-critical apps, right? Because often, obviously, the business impact of damage or loss of data from a critical app is typically much higher, but also the non-critical apps sometimes don't get the attention they deserve, right? And they can act as vectors for malware or malicious actors, breaches to come into the environment, right? So separating those two, can be a relatively simple and really effective win. And similarly with dev and test environments, right? Again, they're not always under the same rigorous controls about quality, for good reason, right? They iterate quickly, so and they deploy new software, and that stuff yet hasn't been fully validated and pen tested, right? So it makes sense to try and separate your non-prod environments from your prod environments, and those are wins that you can make really early in the project, right? And again, like I said, you can make genuine inroads into your security posture by doing that. You can use granular controls where you need to, right? And here I kind of highlight that this critical application here, there's a more granular policy applied to this to limit tier to tier movement to only the ports that are needed, right? And where you have a compliance requirement, you have a known specific risk. Maybe there was a red team exercise and there's vulnerabilities in an application. Maybe this application has a greater risk exposure, right? It's served to external networks or to the internet. You can apply more granular controls there, but what you should try and avoid doing is trying to apply those granular controls everywhere, right? Pick your battles and do that where you need to, because you're going to make faster progress by using, at least in the first phase, more generic controls that provide, if you like, broader and more, and if you like, quicker wins around the environment. But you can iterate, right? And what that really means is, even if you don't apply those those granular controls day one, you can absolutely go back, right? If something changes, if a new risk is found, you can go back and iterate, and you can make those controls more restrictive. Okay, so that's kind of a highlight, in if you like, in theoretical terms about the journey. But what I want to talk about next is kind of what this looks like more in practice, right? And this is our experience, if you like, from doing this at customers. In reality, customer environments are dirty. There's legacy. There are lots of things in the environment that, if you like, dirty secrets that people know about, but they're not really documented. And when you run into these, right, you have to have a practical approach to solving this problem in order to make progress, right? So what this looks like in practice. So where we normally start with customers is with the infrastructure or the shared services or the plumbing, core services, whatever the customer wants to call them. These are the services that really enable the environment to operate. They're not there to directly run the business, right? But they're critical services, right? And they enable the rest of the business applications to operate. And these are things like monitoring and management, LDAP services, Active Directory. They are things like backups, vulnerability management, vulnerability scanning tools. There's a lot of tools that typically the IT services team use to allow the environment to run smoothly, right? So we normally start with those, and the reason being, there's two major reasons. First of all, they're usually pretty ubiquitous, right? They tend to serve the entire environment. So by starting off early, you can write the policy holistically. This means that you write the policy once. The idea is that policy, because we drive metadata-driven policy, it covers the entire environment, and it means that as you then iterate through the business applications, driving towards zero trust, there's a lot less work to do, right? Because all of the core services, all the plumbing is already in place. And it means, and the other big benefit is that when the application teams from the business are focused on writing their policy for their application, they don't have to be distracted, right? Distracted by things that they don't necessarily care about. They don't necessarily care or know how the backups work or how patching is achieved. That's the responsibility of the SA team. So it's best to have that policy written so the app teams, don't have to worry about that. So typically what we do, start with these core services and write that policy. The next step is, we identify a couple of applications that we want to go and target as part of our zero trust project, right? So in this case, we found some workloads in app 1 and 2. We've identified them. We go and deploy the VEN. In Illumio's case, this is, if you like, the agent that installs on the server. And what this does is, once it's installed, you can attach metadata to the object. In this case, we've attached the metadata for applications 1 and 2, because Illumio uses a metadata-driven, intent-based business logic policy model. So we assign the labels that these are application 1 and 2, and they're both in production. And then what the agent does is, the agent doesn't crack packets. It's not a firewall. But what it does do is it orchestrates the stateful firewall that comes baked into the server, right? So Windows filtering platform, IP tables, IP filter, NF filter, etc. And what it does is it starts to use that to collect telemetry data, right? And what you'll start to see is you'll start to get a full picture of truth. And this isn't what the application owners think happens. It isn't what the documentation says happens. It's what actually happens, right? What you're going to see are all the flows and dependencies in the environment, right? And you'll see that those infrastructure services, the flows are green. That's because policy is already prepared for those at a holistic level. So what we see now is, okay, so I see my application 1 and 2, I can kind of see these other applications that, that have relationships with that. So the next thing is to, as well, decorate these with metadata. Now you could install the VEN on these servers as well and increase your visibility, or you can just model them, right? We have this concept of what we call an unmanaged workload, which is just a policy object, right? Which doesn't have the VEN deployed, but you can give it the metadata, right, for context. And now what you see is a picture of the applications with full context, right? I can see that there's this application 3 and application 4. They're consuming my applications at the web tier. Interestingly, I can see there's a couple of non-prod applications as well out there. There's an app 1 dev instance, and for some reason that's talking to the prod instance. That's not expected. And similarly, there's a UAT instance of app 2 that seems to be talking, if you like, an application tier server that seems to be talking straight to the prod database, right? And that's, again, unexpected and probably unwanted. But these are not theoretical situations. We run into this at customers all the time, right? Once you deploy the software and you start to collect telemetry, you get to learn things about the environment that surprises many, right? And is often unknown in the environment. Okay, so the next thing we do, and this comes back to the point of starting with a more generic control and iterating and creating a more granular control later. And this allows you to move more quickly. So in this case, we look at app 1 and app 2. Maybe we don't understand these applications that well. Maybe they were developed in-house and the developers left the company long ago. Maybe they were provided by a vendor and even the vendor isn't around anymore. We don't have a support agreement. Maybe they don't even have it documented, right? Maybe the vendor doesn't really know how these things work. And in this case, we could spend a lot of cycles doing analysis on the internal flows in the application. But to be honest, the biggest risk of lateral movement in the environment are probably flows from elsewhere in the environment, other applications, other locations, where a breach might occur. So we can make a lot of rapid risk reduction by doing what we call ring fencing. And fundamentally, this means writing a policy to say, app 1 can talk to app 1, right? App 2 can talk to app 2, right? We'll do that, we'll write that policy, and all of those complex, if you like, intra-application flows turn green. Okay, so the next step is we look at the dependencies, right? We see that app 3 and app 4 are talking to our apps. We review those and we say, look, we understand what those things are. Those seem sane. We know what those applications do, and they have a good business case for accessing our data. So we'll go ahead and write policy for that. And again, that policy is written, using metadata-driven logic, right? So I will literally say, the application servers in app 3 production can access the web front end or the API for the app 1 production instance, right? So we write that policy, those lines go green. So now we can already, and remember, all of this is fully independent of topology. You don't need to move servers, readdress servers. Because we're doing the control on the workload, it doesn't matter to us if the server resides on the same VLAN, in the same data center, maybe even some are in the cloud, some are on-prem. It's not relevant, right? We're writing the policy entirely based on context, metadata context, and those servers can be theoretically anywhere. They can be right next to each other in switch ports on the same switch. It doesn't matter, right? So having written that policy, what we do next is we say, okay, we're going to put these two applications into enforcement mode, right? Once we do that, those applications are protected, right? They will only allow flows from the other objects we've identified, the other applications we've identified and written into policy. So at this point, those flows from the development and the UAT instances, those will no longer be able to connect to the production instance, right? That connectivity is blocked, right? And similarly, this environment doesn't just contain these applications. There's hundreds of thousands of applications, right? None of those other applications that have not been identified as having a need can access these applications either, right? And that's true, even if some other server or desktop or something in the environment becomes compromised with malware, ransomware, and it's in the environment and it's trying to reach out and identify other servers, it also cannot reach these servers, right? That policy prevents, it's fundamentally least privilege. It's a zero trust policy in effect that makes sure that only what you've expressly defined as allowed is allowed, right? And to the point about zero trust and iteration, if I want to now, I can go back to app 1 and I can say, well, looking at app 1 in more detail now, I see these flows from the database to the web and app tier, and I don't know what that's for, right? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? So maybe as the application owner, I do a bit of review of that and I decide, what, those flows are unnecessary, right? Those, maybe it was just a lazy developer SSHing around the environment. Who knows what? Maybe someone opened up a web browser on the MS SQL server and opened the front end to test the application. Those are not required, right? So we're going to remove those from policy. And when you do that, those flows go red and those flows are no longer permitted. So this, this is the life cycle of how you go about securing each application. And again, you'll iterate through this. You'll start most often with the most critical applications that require protection, and you'll progress on, right, to other applications, to your less critical applications, to your dev environments, right? And this is really the journey that you're on now, is as you do each application, you're reducing the risk of lateral movement in the environment, and you're containing the blast radius of any potential breach that occurs. Okay, so moving on now, automation, right? Now, automation is a key enabler for zero trust maturity, right? And for us to talk about this, it's actually part of the maturity model around zero trust. And I think the reason it's important, right? The reason it's important towards zero trust maturity and implementation is because it does allow you to define a set of consistent and compliant controls evenly across the entire environment. It also allows you to speed up progress in the journey towards your zero trust, objective, and it allows you to reduce attack surface at a faster rate. And I'll kind of explain what that means, right? But fundamentally, if we walk through the process, Illumio collects flow data, right, from all of the endpoints where it's deployed, it aggregates that, and it reports it centrally into the PCE. And the PCE being the central policy engine, the policy compute engine, right, where you define your policy and visualize all of this data. And to that point, by the way, the previous slide, although not a screenshot, that's exactly how we visualize data, right? We demonstrate the applications in application bubbles, which represent, you know, the application name, the environment location, and we visualize all of the connectivity, right, that you can explore. So that's all reported in centrally, and importantly, that data can be fully queried, right, based on metadata, and it can be queried directly through the API, which is important, right? So it's possible for automation to make those queries through the API and actually get the information about the dependencies in the environment, and then you can write policy, right? So ring fencing policy you can automate very simply because it's deterministic. You simply say, I have 10 applications in 3 environments, you know, prod, dev, test. I'm going to write 30 policies. You know, app 1 in prod talks to app 1 prod, app 2 prod talks to app 2 prod, app 3 in dev talks to app 3 dev, right? So, and we've had customers automate that across many hundreds or thousands of applications and build that ring fencing policy. But using the data that you extract from the API, you can also write your intra-app and extra-app policy, right, if needed, right? So what we do, you know, in some customers, again, and this is in support of making progress over perfection, right? Ideally, you would analyze every flow. But what we've seen, you know, some customers do to be able to get their applications enforced quickly is they basically just pull in every flow, right? And they write a policy for it, effectively saying, you know, what's out there today, we're going to allow that to occur, and we're going to stop anything new happening, and then we're going to iterate on that again. And that iteration, like at the time of creation, you can review those against your standards. You can automate this as well. So you can say, look, if I see any flows that are over certain ports, like, I don't know, plain text ports, like Telnet or FTP, or I see flows over protocols I'm not happy about, like SMB, I can just decline to create policy for those, right? If I see a flow from dev to prod, I'm not going to create that policy. You can do those sorts of things, right? Or you can just use this as a baseline and iterate, like I said, you know, grandfather in the policy you see, and then you can iterate on that to improve it later. And you can integrate this process with workflow tools, right? We have customers that have used ServiceNow, and they integrate that, you know, that gives them the workflow and approval change management process, and then they can integrate ServiceNow directly into the API. So again, they can fully automate discovery, if you like, the creation, the review, the approval, and the provisioning of policies into the PCE. So automation is a hugely powerful tool. And you can even use it for things like workload quarantine. Like we have a Splunk app that we supply, and not only does that provide you additional tools around searching, indexing, and kind of like visualizing and viewing data, but it allows you a dashboard where you can do things like you know, quarantine workloads that appear to be you know, maliciously impacted. Like if you see a workload buzzing away doing its thing, and suddenly it creates, you know, 10,000 connections to everything else in the environment, you know, you can quarantine that, right? And you can set triggers, and if you know, if you want to, you can even automate that. But typically, we'd recommend sort of a human in the process at least to validate that. Okay, so I've talked about the process of how you can use automation to help you in, you know, in your zero trust maturity. But let's talk about some real customer use cases. These are customers, you know, that I've worked with, where these practices have been actually implemented, and so and these are all different examples, right? But you can kind of see some of the examples about how this is done, right? Okay, so in the first example, it's a global financial bank, and they actually did full integration. They already had a workflow tool that does all of their requesting and approval management, and they actually use it for their firewall requests today, for security requests, although that's not API integrated, they use it for workflow management. So they integrated the Illumio API directly into this tooling, right? And that allowed application owners to see the flows related to their application, to convert those into policy, right, by saying, yes, 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 I want this one I don't want, etc. And then it would go through the approval process and then would be automatically provisioned through the API, right? It also allowed them to manage the life cycle around things like the enforcement state. But this was a capability that allowed them to change, you know, firewall requests from, in some cases, weeks down to just hours, right? And theoretically, it could be minutes, seconds or minutes, right? But, you know, the hours are really there to accommodate approval processes, etc. And because those rules are based on real application flows, they're very accurate, right? You know, one of the problems you have with firewall requests is the requester doesn't always know what they need. So one of two things can happen, right? They can put in a request and the request, is implemented, it's tested, and it's not complete, and it requires an iteration. Or some cases, application teams are keen to avoid that, right? So they just put in overly permissive requests to make sure they don't have to iterate, right? Which can lead to an overly permissive policy in the firewalls. The second example is actually a global SaaS provider. They do things like time management, HR type software. Now their environment is fully automated as it stands, right? So they integrated Illumio directly in from the service registry. The service registry is if you like, the data source that defines truth around all of the dependencies of their application and microservice components. So they just baked the policy process into that. So when application owners identify a dependency and they link the applications together, the policy is defined as part of that process. And in fact, it means that all servers, the minute they're instantiated, right, all containers, they come up in full enforcement mode with the correct policy applied. So, this isn't for everyone. It requires, a real DevOps mentality and an approach to automation, but it's very powerful. The third was a large pharmaceutical, and their approach was actually to just, a simpler approach, but it was simply, as they onboard servers, they automatically integrate that with CMDB, and they use ServiceNow, not for workflow, but for configuration management database. And they just pull in the correct metadata, apply the labels, and they automatically have this ring fencing policy applied by default. So as soon as a server is labeled, it inherits the access it needs, right? And then for all of the external interact flows, if you like, we talked about, they did that process of kind of grandfathering them in, right? They said, okay, everything we see, we'll just write a policy for. We'll get into enforcement. At least we can kind of draw a line in the sand, and then we'll give service owners 12 months to go and review those and justify them, right? And if they can't justify them, then they're going to be removed. And that was the approach they took. And the last example, this was a financial institution, actually an insurance company, and they took a much more simple approach to this in their first phase. They just created some simple automation that made queries about the flow data and just produced an Excel template which detailed the flows. They emailed that to the service owner. The service owner just went down the template and clicked a drop down to say whether the flow was good or bad, and then they just ingested that template back in to create policy, right? So this was, if you like, a way. It's similar to grandfathering all the flows, but they had a process to review those before they went in, right? So the application owner could qualify if those were required or not. And now moving, and this was fine for deployment of a few thousand workloads. Now they're moving into a global deployment, and they're actually deploying a full self-service capability based on ServiceNow for their workflow. Okay, so just some of the challenges, right? Because when you do a project like this, there's going to be challenges. But I think the key takeaway from this is that the challenges are almost entirely organizational. They're not technical. Obviously there's technical work to do, and there's problems to solve, right? But they were not really the hard things in the projects that I've worked on, right? So the biggest issue is just cultural change, right? So, zero trust, it can be a big cultural change for organizations, right? App teams are used to everything working and maybe fighting with the security team about flows to and from untrusted networks. And now they have to, they have to come to terms with the idea that actually they're going to have to justify all the connectivity, right? So, and for teams that are managed and measured on things like uptime and performance, that could be challenging, right? And part of the cultural change is that you need to start delivering the message that security is going to be one of the KPIs, right? It's one of the things they need to be measured on, and they're going to have to put some effort in, right? To basically achieve the objective that the organizations set out for them. Application-centric policy like Illumio is extremely advantageous, right? It gives you a lot of context, it makes policy definition easier, and it greatly reduces operational overhead, but it does require a change in thinking, right? And especially in the network team and security team, sometimes people have to rethink how they, rethink firewall policy and doing that in a metadata-driven way. Business engagement is super important, right? And it can't be ignored. And that is, if you just, ultimately, because you're writing metadata-based business logic policy, the best source of data for that is the business, right? They understand their applications and their dependencies. And there's a lot of benefits to the business actually, right? So you need to go and engage them, right? Because if you don't, you know, if you decide you're going to kind of go around them, then you're going to run into that later, right? So I can't emphasize enough the importance of engaging early with the business. And you know, basing your policy on metadata requires that you manage your metadata. I mean, it seems obvious, right? But most organizations will recognize that, you know, many organizations have metadata, but they recognize that the quality of the metadata is not perfect, right? And it rarely is. So I think it's not a barrier. You can deliver these projects with imperfect metadata, but you do need a process in place, right, to iteratively improve that data, and that actually provides a lot of benefits to the organization. And the last change, and this is more purely for the network security guys, is there's a little bit of a change in thinking, moving from enforcement in the network in choke points like firewalls and doing that on the endpoint, right? And that's you know, there are people that have been used to using firewalls for many years, and it really just requires, if you like, a little bit of a shift in thinking for these people. Okay, so that summarizes that. So I'm nearly finished. I think my last slide really is just to give you some key takeaways, and this is a summary of probably the key lessons, right? There was a lot of content here, so these are the things probably to keep front of mind, right? So organizational support and business buy-in are key to success in any zero trust project, right? And that's because of the cultural change I mentioned, right? That has to be driven from someone senior in the business. You know, you need to think about progress over perfection, right? Which means identify your quick wins and iterate to improve maturity, right? And to that point, you know, one of the key lessons is do not let perfection be a barrier to progress, right? And that is probably the key thing to think about when doing a zero trust program, is don't get stuck trying to achieve perfection early, right? You know, make progress and iterate to get the results you want. Okay, so that's all I have. I'd like to say, just, you know, if you want to learn more about zero trust, right, and the maturity model, you know, there's resources on the Illumio website at www.illumio.com. There's also the Forrester website. You know, that is the, if you like, the golden source of truth on zero trust. I encourage you to go and take a look at that information. And that's all. So on that note, I just want to say thank you for the time today. I hope this was useful, and hopefully this helps you in planning your journey to zero trust and all the benefits it's going to provide to your business. Great. Thank you.